Avoidance and Depression. Hello, I'm your presenter, Caitlin Barr. In this presentation, we will examine how avoidance contributes to depression and how depression in turn leads to greater avoidance. Targeting avoidance behaviors in therapy is an effective way of combating depression and preventing relapse. Let's take a moment to understand why this is such an important topic. Depression is characterized by feelings of persistent sadness, anhedonia, which is the loss of interest or pleasure, low mood, and poor motivation. Depression is prevalent. In fact, it's the most common disorder encountered by mental health care professionals. Depression is costly. There's a financial cost. Depression ranks among the highest contributors to the global burden of disease, due to lost workdays, disability, and related healthcare costs. There's also an emotional cost, the high price of human suffering and distress, both for the depressed individual and for his or her close friends and family. Then there's a physical cost. Depression takes a toll on one's physical health, including increasing the risk of heart attacks. In addition, depression is associated with higher rates of substance abuse, and there is a high rate of relapse. Now let's take a look at avoidance. Avoidance is defined as refraining or escaping from an action, person, or thing. This can be adaptive or maladaptive. In many cases, avoidance has an adaptive purpose. Let's say that you are preparing a meal, and you know that the stove is hot. You avoid touching the stove to prevent from getting burned. This is a healthy way to live. However, avoidance can also be maladaptive. For example, a depressed individual might take a nap as a way of avoiding thoughts of hopelessness. While this may provide temporary relief from the hopeless thoughts, it does not provide any sort of long-term solution. So in examining the role of avoidance in depression, I want to know, how can maladaptive avoidance behaviors be overcome in the treatment of depression? From a clinical perspective, understanding how avoidance contributes to depression in the first place, how it maintains depression, and the role it plays in relapse are critical to effectively treating depression. I will expound on the behavioral framework for depression in a moment, but first let's take a closer look at the learning principles of operant conditioning and negative reinforcement and their application to depression. Operant conditioning involves a three-way association. A specific stimulus signals a response which results in a particular outcome. For example, in a Skinner box, the lever could represent a discriminative stimulus, pulling the lever would represent the response, and the distribution of a food pellet would represent the outcome. Negative reinforcement is a form of operant conditioning where the response, that is a behavior, becomes more frequent insofar as it removes an undesirable outcome. For example, imagine that you feel cold, so you put on your coat, and the cold feeling is removed. Putting on a coat when you are cold is negatively reinforcing. The likelihood that you will put your coat on in the future to stop feeling cold is increased. The response or behavior is increased by taking away an undesired outcome. A more thorough explanation of operant conditioning and the principles of reinforcement and punishment can be found at this YouTube link. So what does operant conditioning and negative reinforcement have to do with avoidance and depression? As I've already alluded to, maladaptive avoidance behaviors act as negative reinforcers, which actually perpetuate the cycle of depression. Targeting avoidance behaviors in therapy is an effective way to combat depression and prevent relapse. This leads us to my hypothesis. Establishing new behaviors to combat avoidance via behavioral activation therapy for depression reduces the risk of relapse. In this next section of the presentation, we will review some of the theoretical and applied literature pertaining to the role of avoidance in depression. Behavioral models of depression find their roots in the work of Forster. Forster believed that behavioral psychology had much to offer in the way of conceptualizing depression due to its emphasis on uncovering the types of circumstances that increase and decrease particular behaviors. He viewed depression as the result of accumulated experiences in which the individual's behavior either doesn't result in positive reward or is negatively reinforced. According to Furster, this lack of positive reinforcement from one's environment facilitates depression in 3 ways: a turning inward, a narrowing of available adaptive behaviors, and a preoccupation with escape and avoidance. Furster emphasized that treating depression must establish positively reinforced behaviors that are absent in depressed individuals. The work of Furster and others led to the development of behavioral activation therapy. In brief, behavioral activation therapy for depression is an evidence-based practice founded on behavioral learning principles, which focus on facilitating behavior change in the treatment of depression. Behavioral activation therapies place particular attention on the role of avoidance in the development and preservation of depression. Next, we will review a number of recent studies relating to the role of avoidance in depression to better understand how to combat avoidance and reduce the risk of relapse. We will look at these studies through the 3 ways proposed by True in which avoidance may be contributing to depression. First, by limiting access to sources of positive reinforcement. Second, by promoting negative information processing biases. And finally, by allowing approach preservation, which is the continued pursuit of unattainable goals, to go unchecked. In the literature, rumination is conceptualized as a form of avoidance behavior. The constant attention and focus on the causes and consequences of one situation that is common to depression is not productive. Instead of taking action and making changes where possible, the depressed individual is stuck in a maladaptive pattern of rumination. In effect, rumination limits the depressed individual's access to sources of positive reinforcement. A study by Brockmeyer and colleagues sought to establish evidence for a connection between rumination, behavioral avoidance, mode of satisfaction, and depression. To this end, they collected data on 160 individuals suffering from major depressive disorder and analyzed it using a product of coefficients approach. Their findings support the conceptualization of rumination as a form of avoidance in depression, showing that behavioral avoidance and inadequate mode of satisfaction together mediate the relationship between avoidance and depression. They speculated that rumination is avoidant in nature because it prevents depressed individuals from engaging in activities and interactions that could potentially be distressing. This ties in with True's point that avoidance limits access to sources of positive reinforcement. Of course, this was not an exhaustive study of all the possible ways in which rumination is connected to depression, but the connection between the 2 is clear. Brockmeyer and colleagues endorse behavioral activation therapy insofar as it addresses rumination as an ineffective avoidance strategy. Although the results of this study were correlative and not causative, there is reason to believe that rumination is an important target in reducing the risk of relapse. In line with my hypothesis, exchanging rumination strategies with effective problem-solving skills can prevent relapse. Likewise, a study by Krieger and colleagues examined the role of rumination and avoidance in depression and their relationship to the act of practicing self-compassion. This was the first study to examine the difference in self-compassion between depressed individuals and never depressed individuals. To this end, they collected data on 142 clinically depressed individuals and 120 never depressed individuals. Statistical analysis comparing the groups showed that depressed individuals show lower levels of self-compassion in comparison to never depressed individuals. In addition, statistical analysis revealed a negative correlation between avoidance and self-compassion. The greater the tendency to avoid, the less self-compassion, as well as a negative correlation between rumination and self-compassion. The greater the tendency to ruminate, the less self-compassion. In the article, the authors speculate that higher levels of self-compassion may enable the individual to keep negative experiences in perspective and provide greater resilience under stress. Whether this lack of self-compassion is specific to depressive disorder is not clear from this study. However, it is worth noting that fostering self-compassion when treating depression may serve to prevent relapse. Furthermore, fostering greater levels of self-compassion is associated with lesser rumination and lesser avoidance, in line with the integrative model proposed by True and results of the previously discussed study by Brockmeyer and colleagues. This next study coincides with the second way proposed by True that avoidance contributes to depression. Avoidance promotes negative information processing biases. Nasreen and colleagues examined whether one session of behavioral activation therapy was enough to reduce avoidance tendencies in depressed individuals. Two groups comprised of depressed individuals were used in this study: 22 patients who received a single session of behavioral activation therapy and 24 patients in the waiting list control group. Of particular interest are the results of the approach avoidance task and the difference between the two groups. The approach avoidance task is based on findings that avoidance tendencies facilitate arm movements that push objects away from oneself, while approach tendencies facilitate arm movements that pull objects closer to oneself. This study utilized an approach avoidance task, testing participants' responses to a range of facial expressions: positive, negative, or neutral. Overall, they found a decrease in depressive symptoms in the treatment group in comparison to the control group. In addition, they found an increased approach tendency to positive facial expressions in the approach avoidance task in the treatment group in comparison to the control group. Thus, a single session of behavioral activation therapy promoted an improvement in their negative information processing biases. Whether these results were maintained following the study is not clear. Nevertheless, it appears that behavioral activation therapy is effective in treating negative information processing biases in depressed individuals. Skazpanik and colleagues were similarly interested in investigating information processing biases among depressed individuals. Specifically, they were interested in evaluating how depressed individuals perceive environmental reinforcers. They developed an experimental behavioral approach motivation paradigm based on the principles previously discussed, that motor movement is implicated in positive and negative approach avoidance tendencies. Participants included 21 depressed individuals and 23 healthy controls. They participated in a task using a joystick to respond to liked and disliked activities that were matched according to the individual's particular set of likes and dislikes. In general, the depressed group reported fewer liked activities than the healthy controls. In addition, although the results were not significant, there was a trend among the depressed group to demonstrate weaker avoidance of disliked activities, suggestive of an underlying negative bias in choosing environmental opportunities among depressed individuals. Thus, effective therapy targeting avoidance behaviors will also address underlying negative information processing biases to prevent relapse. Moreover, this study is in line with two of True's points, namely that avoidance narrows access to sources of positive reinforcement and involves negative information processing biases. One way that behavioral activation therapy combats avoidance is by increasing the individual's access to sources of positive reinforcement, the importance of which was illustrated in the prior study. This includes setting and working towards obtainable goals that promote healthy activation. A study by Chum and colleagues assessed the value of using a Fitbit in conjunction with behavioral activation therapy in the treatment of depression. Fitbits were distributed to a group of individuals participating in behavioral activation therapy in a group format. Data was collected during the twice-weekly sessions over 18 weeks, and participants received a personalized printout with feedback on their physical activity. When treatment was completed, 36 participants were interviewed to obtain information on the added value of Fitbit use. Of particular note was the finding regarding the perceived helpfulness of the Fitbit in promoting goal setting. Several of the participants reported that they used the feedback from their Fitbit to track their progress on their physical activity goals. Setting obtainable goals combats the third way avoidance contributes to depression, according to True. A recent study by Miles and colleagues was designed to evaluate whether behavioral activation therapy could be effective in an intensive format. They used a small sample, just 8 participants with major depressive disorder for their initial query. The intervention included activity scheduling to encourage participants in activities congruent with the individual's personal goals and values. This aspect of behavioral activation therapy addresses the third way True suggested that avoidance contributes to depression: to seize the pursuit of unattainable goals and alternatively work towards obtainable, worthwhile goals. The study found that time-intensive behavioral activation therapy is feasible and was associated with significant improvements of depressive symptoms in 6 out of 8 participants, 3/4. This study did not include measures to analyze specific mechanism of change. Nevertheless, in line with Forster and True, it is likely that the pursuit and attainment of personal goals contributed to the treatment response. Maintaining these goals and building on them after therapy is likely to reduce the risk of relapse. Behavioral psychology and learning principles have important implications for clinical practice and the treatment of depression. Understanding the role of avoidance and its strength as a form of negative reinforcement is essential to effectively treat depression. In this final section of the presentation, I will summarize and discuss the research findings. Here is a summary of the research findings. Rumination functions as a form of avoidance in depression. Self-compassion is negatively related to depression and rumination. Brief behavioral activation therapy addresses negative information processing biases. Negative information processing biases result in narrowed access to positive experiences. Fitbit feedback promotes goal tracking alongside behavioral activation therapy, and a time-intensive format of behavioral activation therapy is potentially effective and feasible. These findings have implications for mental health care workers and clinical psychologists, for affected individuals and their friends and families. Awareness is an excellent place to start. By understanding and recognizing the various forms of avoidance and their contributions to depression, then take advantage of behavioral activation therapy to target avoidance behaviors, exchange maladaptive behaviors for effective problem-solving skills, and combat depression. Increase access to sources of positive reinforcement, understand the possible negative information processing biases at play, and work towards obtainable, worthwhile goals. Based on these findings, I would be interested to see future research that explains the neural basis for these changes, particularly regarding the association between self-compassion and avoidance. Also, further studies on the most effective length of behavioral activation therapy are called for, considering the small sample size of the time-intensive format proposed by Miles and colleagues. I would also recommend additional measures indicating whether these treatment gains are maintained long-term. In conclusion, breaking the negatively reinforcing cycle of avoidance's contribution to depression is essential in preventing relapse. Addressing one's tendency to ruminate, increasing one's self-compassion, addressing underlying negative information processing biases, and working towards obtainable goals while improving access to sources of positive reinforcement are ways that behavioral activation therapy combats avoidance and depression. Maintaining and building upon these gains may reduce the risk of relapse, as stated in my hypothesis. Here's a list of references.